Okay, picture a therapist's office. It's supposed to be a sanctuary, right? A place of absolute, total confidentiality. But what happens if, inside that safe space, a patient reveals they have a plan? A plan to seriously hurt someone? Well, that's the moment a therapist's duty to their patient slams right into their duty to the public. And it creates one of the most difficult ethical decisions a professional will ever have to make.
So what's the right call? Does a therapist's promise of privacy to their patient outweigh their duty to protect a potential victim? For a long, long time, the answer to that was pretty simple. But over the last 50 years or so, that has all changed. And I mean dramatically. It's created this legal and ethical tightrope that clinicians are still trying to walk every single day.
To really get why this is so complicated now, we actually need to rewind the clock. We've got to go back to a time when that bond between a patient and their therapist, it was seen as something truly, almost sacredly unbreakable. Before 1976, confidentiality in therapy was, and this is the legal term, nearly sacrosanct. A therapist's office was basically a vault. What you said in there stayed in there, period. Disclosures were incredibly rare, really only happening if there was a direct court order or if a patient was an immediate danger to themselves. But a danger to somebody else, that was a huge gray area. And for the most part, that vault stayed sealed. And then it all changed. It took a tragic event and the landmark court case that followed to blow that whole system up. This case didn't just tweak a rule, it completely reshaped the very architecture of mental health law and ethics as we know it. The case that turned everything on its head was Tarasoff v. Regents of the University of California, and its ruling was nothing short of a legal earthquake. For the first time, a court declared that when a patient poses a serious danger to another person, the therapist's duty to protect that potential victim is more important than patient confidentiality. All of a sudden, that unbreakable vow, it could be broken. And this created a really subtle but incredibly profound change in what was expected. The responsibility went from a simple duty to warn, which might have just meant making a quick phone call, to an active duty to protect. And that's a whole different ballgame. Protect means taking real, concrete steps. We're talking warning the victim, yes, but also calling the police, maybe even starting commitment proceedings. It became a much, much heavier burden for therapists to carry. But the story definitely did not end with Tarasoff. You can think of that ruling like a stone dropped in a pond. The ripples of that decision just kept expanding outwards, getting wider and wider through a whole series of other really important court cases. So that first big ripple hits in 1980 with a case called Lipari v. Sears. Here, the court decided that the duty to protect exists even if a specific identifiable victim isn't named. This was huge. It meant therapists suddenly had a responsibility to the public at large if a patient just seemed like a general threat. That circle of protection got a whole lot bigger. Then, fast forward to 1983, and the Jablonski case adds another tricky layer. It established that a therapist couldn't just take their patient's word for things anymore. Nope. They now had a duty to actually dig into past medical records as part of their risk assessment. The job became much more, investigative. And finally, in 2004, Ewing versus Goldstein expanded things even further. Now, a therapist's duty to protect could be triggered by a credible threat that came from a patient's family member, even if the patient themselves never said a word about it in session. All of a sudden, therapists had to listen to credible voices from outside the therapy room. So all these different rulings have led us to this incredibly confusing patchwork legal landscape. There's no single federal rule. So a therapist in California, for example, has a mandatory duty to act. They have to. But a therapist in Texas only has a permissive duty, which means they can break confidentiality, but they don't have to. And in other places, there's no specific law at all. Just imagine trying to navigate that, especially now with telehealth, where your therapist and you could be in totally different states. This brings us right up to the present day, and the immense, immense pressure this patchwork of laws puts on clinicians. They are constantly being forced to make these unbelievably difficult judgment calls, where the consequences are just massive no matter what they decide. And this really gets to the heart of the conflict. The very beauty that's designed to protect the public can actually end up undermining the therapy itself. Think about it. If a patient is afraid that what they say could get them in trouble or be reported, they might hold back the exact information the therapist needs to actually help them. And that paradoxically could make the situation even more dangerous. It creates this classic damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. If a therapist breaks confidentiality and they turn out to be wrong, it was a false alarm, they've just violated their patient's rights. But if they don't break confidentiality and something awful happens, they failed to protect the public. Either way, they could face a lawsuit. And this leads a lot of them to practice defensively, making decisions based on fear of getting sued rather than on their pure clinical judgment. So, with all of this complexity and all this risk, how does a professional even begin to make the right call? Well, thankfully, they aren't just left to navigate this maze all alone. Professional organizations like the American Psychological Association, they provide a framework. Think of it like a guidebook for ethical decision-making in these impossible situations. This framework lays out some really clear, actionable steps. First, use objective, structured tools to assess the risk. This helps take your own personal bias out of the equation. Second, if you do have to disclose information, practice what's called proportional disclosure. Share only the absolute minimum necessary to keep people safe and nothing more. Third, document everything, your reasoning, who you talked to, what you did, write it all down. And finally, and this is so important, collaborate. This is not a decision to be made in a vacuum. Talk to lawyers, law enforcement, other professionals. At the end of the day, the goal of this whole framework is to find that incredibly delicate balance. It's about honoring the foundational value of confidentiality, that trust that makes therapy work, while at the same time upholding the profound duty to protect the wider community. It's not about choosing one over the other. It's about finding a way for both to exist responsibly, side by side. And looking ahead, believe it or not, things are probably only going to get more complicated. With therapy moving online across state lines, with AI starting to play a role in mental health care, our very ideas of privacy and threat are changing right before our eyes. And that leaves us with one final, crucial question. In this brand new world of tech and shifting boundaries, how will this duty to protect have to evolve all over again?